Hello and welcome back to the Brit Lit Book Club. I'm your host Vanessa, and I'm thrilled you've joined me for an exploration of one of Victorian literature's most important but often overlooked voices. Before we dive in, grab yourself a cup of tea if you can. I'm sipping a strong Lancashire brew this morning, and there's something wonderfully appropriate about a northern tea as we venture into the industrial heartland of Victorian England. Several weeks ago, we explored how Dickens used A Christmas Carol to argue for compassionate capitalism and social responsibility. Today, we're staying with the theme of industrial fiction, but shifting our perspective dramatically. We're leaving London behind and heading north to Manchester, the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution, to meet a woman who gave voice to the working classes in a way that even Dickens couldn't. Elizabeth Gaskell. If you know her at all, you might know her as the author of Cranford, the gentle comedy of manners about a small town full of eclectic ladies. Or perhaps you've seen one of the many adaptations of North and South, her industrial romance between a southern gentleman's daughter and a northern mill owner. I have a classics book club where we read one classic book each quarter and get together to discuss and celebrate that book. A few months ago, we read North and South. After reading that, I really wanted to get to know more about Elizabeth Gaskell. She was really a revolutionary writer who brought the reality of industrial working class life into middle-class drawing rooms. She wrote from inside the industrial North, married to a Unitarian minister who worked directly with the poor, and she used her position to bridge the enormous gap between workers and employers, North and South, suffering and indifference. So let's venture into the smoky, vibrant, heartbreaking world of industrial Manchester and discover how this minister's wife became one of the most powerful voices for social reform in Victorian England. Let's talk a little bit about life in industrial Manchester. Elizabeth Cleghorn Stevenson was born in London in 1810, but her life changed dramatically before she could even remember it. When she was just 13 months old, her mother died, and baby Elizabeth was sent north to live with her aunt, Hannah Lum, in Knutsford, a small Cheshire market town that would later become the model for Cranford. This early loss shaped everything about Elizabeth's life and writing. She grew up knowing what it meant to lose someone irreplaceable, to be raised by someone other than your parents, to feel the absence of a mother's love, even if you couldn't quite remember it. Her father, William Stevenson, a Unitarian minister turned civil servant and writer, remained in London, and Elizabeth saw him only occasionally during her childhood. But she found something precious in Knutsford, a security, education, and a deep connection to rural English life. Her Aunt Hannah provided a loving, stable home, and the small market town gave Elizabeth a window into traditional English society that would inform all her writing about community and social bonds. Then came another devastating loss. Elizabeth had a beloved brother, John, who went to sea and simply disappeared. No body, no explanation, just the terrible uncertainty of not knowing what happened to someone you love. This haunted her for the rest of her life and appears again and again in her fiction, that particular pain of ambiguous loss, of waiting for someone who will never come home. Despite these sorrows, Elizabeth received an unusually good education for a woman of her time. She attended a progressive school in Stratford-upon-Avon, run by the Byerley sisters, where she studied Latin, French, Italian, and drawing alongside the unusual feminine accomplishments. This education gave her the intellectual confidence to tackle serious subjects in her writing. She wasn't limited to sentimental domestic tales because she had the tools to engage with complex social and economic questions. In 1832, at age 22, Elizabeth married William Gaskell, a Unitarian minister, and moved to Manchester. This was the defining experience of her life, the moment when everything changed. Manchester in the 1830s and 40s was like nothing else in the world. It was the first truly industrial city, Cottonopolis they called it, the center of textile and manufacturing that clothed much of the world. The cotton mills ran day and night, powered by steam engines, employing thousands of workers in conditions that were transforming human society faster than anyone could comprehend. The city had grown explosively. In 1801, Manchester had about 75,000 people. By 1851, it had over 300,000 people. People flooded in from rural areas seeking factory work, and the city couldn't build housing fast enough. Workers lived in hastily constructed back-to-back houses with no sanitation, no clean water, and multiple families sharing single rooms. The air was thick with coal smoke and cotton fibers. The rivers ran with dye chemicals from the textile mills. Disease was rampant. Cholera epidemics swept through regularly, killing thousands. Life expectancy in Manchester's working-class districts was sometimes as low as 17 years. But what made Elizabeth's experience unique was her position within this world. As a wife of a Unitarian minister, she had access to both worlds, the comfortable middle-class sphere of mill owners and professionals, and the desperate working-class neighborhoods where her husband's ministry took them. William Gaskell wasn't a Church of England clergyman, preaching from a comfortable distance. Unitarians were religious dissenters who believed in social action and direct engagement with the poor. The Gaskells visited working-class homes, provided charity and education, and worked directly with the people struggling with poverty, illness, and industrial accidents. Elizabeth saw things that most middle-class women never witnessed. She saw children working 12-hour days in the mills, their fingers bleeding from handling raw cotton. She saw women whose husbands had been killed or maimed by industrial accidents, left with no income and no support. She saw families evicted from their homes during economic downturns when the mills closed and workers had no wages. But she also saw something else that was often invisible to middle-class observers: the dignity, intelligence, and moral strength of the working-class families. She attended workers' meetings, heard their poetry and songs, learned about their reading clubs and self-education efforts. She discovered the working classes weren't the brutish, ignorant mob that middle-class stereotypes suggested. They were just people struggling to maintain humanity and dignity in impossible circumstances. The turning point came in 1845 when Elizabeth's only son, Willie, died of scarlet fever when he was just 10 months old. The grief was devastating, and her husband encouraged her to write as a way of processing her pain. She began working on what would become Mary Barton, her first novel. But the novel wasn't just personal therapy. It was a deliberate attempt to make middle-class readers understand what was happening in the industrial cities they preferred to ignore. Elizabeth had seen how ignorance and indifference on both sides created conflict and suffering. She believed that if she could make people see each other as human beings rather than abstractions, social understanding might lead to social reform. Mary Barton, published anonymously, just like some other female writers that we've talked about, in 1848, was a bombshell. The novel tells the story of a young working-class woman in Manchester whose father, John Barton, becomes so desperate during an economic downturn that he murders a mill owner's son. What made the novel shocking wasn't the murder plot. Victorian readers were used to sensational stories. What shocked them was Elizabeth's sympathetic portrayal of the working classes and her explicit criticism of mill owners' indifference to their workers' suffering. The novel opens with a description of contrast between workers' homes and employers' mansions. Elizabeth shows mill owners living in luxury, while their workers are starving during economic downturns. She describes children dying of diseases caused by malnutrition and poor sanitation while employers worry about profit margins. But what really disturbed middle-class readers was Elizabeth's exploration of why workers might turn to violence. John Barton isn't portrayed as naturally wicked or inherently criminal. He's a loving father and initially a hard-working, loyal employee. But when economic forces beyond his control leave him unemployed and unable to feed his family, when he sees his fellow workers dying while employers continue living in luxury, he becomes radicalized. Elizabeth doesn't excuse his violence, but she makes readers understand it as a desperate response to intolerable conditions. This was deeply unsettling to Victorian middle-class readers, who wanted to believe that social hierarchy was natural and that workers' poverty was their own fault. The novel was published in October 1848, just months after revolutionary uprisings had swept across Europe. The Chartist movement in England had been demanding political reform, and there was genuine fear among the wealthy that Britain might experience its own revolution. Mary Barton seemed to be explaining, and perhaps even justifying, workers' anger and resentment. Mill owners were furious. They accused Elizabeth of misunderstanding economics, of encouraging class warfare, and romanticizing the working class. Some critics suggested that a woman couldn't possibly understand industrial relations and should stick to domestic fiction. But working-class readers recognized the truth in Elizabeth's portrayal. They wrote to her expressing gratitude that someone had finally told their story accurately and sympathetically. The novel became enormously popular and influential, establishing Elizabeth as a major voice in the social problem novel genre. Elizabeth Gaskell's position as a woman writer gave her a unique authority and unique challenges when addressing social reform. Victorian society believed that women belonged in the domestic sphere and shouldn't concern themselves with politics or economics. Yet women writers like Elizabeth were using their supposed expertise in domestic and emotional matters to intervene in public debates. The strategy was clever. Elizabeth could write about social problems from a moral and emotional perspective, that was considered appropriately feminine, while still making powerful political and economic arguments. She focused on how industrial capitalism affected families, children, and domestic life, subjects women were allowed to discuss, while actually critiquing the entire industrial system. Her gender also gave her access to perspectives that male writers like Dickens couldn't easily reach. She could write convincingly about working-class women's experiences. The mothers struggling to feed their children, the daughters forced into prostitution by economic desperation, the wives managing households on inadequate wages. In North and South, published in 1855, Elizabeth refined her approach to industrial fiction. The novel tells of a story of Margaret Hale, a young woman from a genteel south of England, who moves to the fictional northern industrial town of Milton, based on Manchester. There she meets John Thornton, a self-made mill owner, and gradually learns to understand both workers' grievances and employers' perspectives. This novel is more balanced than Mary Barton. Elizabeth had been criticized for being too sympathetic to workers and too harsh on employers, so she made a conscious effort to show both sides. Thornton is played as a hard-working and honest, not cruel or exploitative, but also limited in his understanding of workers' lives and needs. The romance between Margaret and Thornton becomes a metaphor for the possibility of understanding across class and regional divides. Margaret brings Southern gentility and moral sensitivity. Thornton brings Northern practicality and industrial expertise. Their eventual union suggests that social harmony requires both compassion and economic understanding. But Elizabeth doesn't make it easy or romantic. Margaret and Thornton clash repeatedly over industrial relations, workers' rights, and social responsibility. Their debates represent the actual arguments happening in Victorian society about how to balance profit with human welfare, efficiency with justice. The novel also gives voice to working-class characters who are neither saintly victims nor dangerous revolutionaries. Nicholas Higgins, a union organizer, is portrayed as intelligent and principled, genuinely concerned about workers' welfare, even when Margaret disagrees with his tactics. Let's talk about the North versus the South of England. One of Elizabeth Gaskell's most important contributions was making visible the enormous cultural and economic divide between Northern and Southern England, a divide that still exists in many ways today. In Victorian England, the North and the South weren't just geographical distinctions. They represented completely different ways of life and sets of values. The South, particularly London, and rural counties represented old money, established social hierarchies, refined manners, and agricultural or commercial wealth. The North represented new money, social mobility, practical values, and industrial wealth. Southerners looked down on Northerners as rough, uncultured, and obsessed with money. Northerners saw Southerners as idle, snobbish, and living off inherent wealth rather than honest work. These stereotypes created real barriers to understanding and cooperation. In North and South, Margaret initially shares typical Southern prejudices. She finds Milton ugly, smoky, and depressing compared to the green countryside she's left behind. She sees the mill owners as uncultured and the workers as rough and potentially dangerous. But gradually, she learns to appreciate Northern virtues, the directness, the work ethic, the intellectual curiosity of workers who attend lectures and run reading clubs, the entrepreneurial energy of men like Thornton who've built businesses from nothing. At the same time, Elizabeth shows Northerners learning to value Southern qualities, Margaret's moral refinement, her concern for beauty and culture alongside material prosperity, her ability to see beyond immediate economic calculations to longer-term human values. The novel suggests that both regions need each other, that the South's cultivation and moral sensitivity must be combined with the North's energy and productivity to create a truly prosperous society. This wasn't just literary metaphor. Elizabeth was making a real argument about how Victorian England should develop. The regional divide also had political implications. The North was where industrialization and its problems were most visible, where workers were organizing unions and demanding political rights, where new forms of social organization were being tested. The South represented traditional power structures and resistance to change. By making this divide visible and exploring sympathetically, Elizabeth helped her primarily Southern middle-class readers understand that the Industrial Revolution wasn't just an economic change. It was transforming English culture and identity in fundamental ways. Elizabeth Gaskell's influence on Victorian social reform was substantial, though it's often overshadowed by Dickens' greater fame. Her novels contributed to growing pressure for factory reforms, better working conditions, and recognition of workers' rights. They helped change how middle-class readers thought about working classes, from dangerous abstractions to real people with legitimate grievances. But her legacy extends beyond social reform. She demonstrated that women writers could address serious political and economic issues while still writing within acceptable feminine genres like the domestic novel. She paved the way for later women writers like George Eliot, who would tackle even more controversial subjects. Her approach to social fiction, trying to understand all perspectives using romance and domestic stories to explore larger social issues, focusing on misunderstanding rather than villainy as the root of social conflict, created a template that many later writers followed. The regional divide she explored remains relevant in Britain today. The North-South divide in the wealth, political power, and cultural influence continues to shape British politics and identity. The debates about industrial decline, regional inequality, and cultural differences that Elizabeth wrote about echo in contemporary discussion about post-industrial communities and economic development. Her insight that social problems require both systemic reform and human understanding, that you need both better policies and better relationships across class and cultural divides, remains valuable for thinking about contemporary social challenges. All right, I've got a few book recommendations for you today. For Understanding Gaskell's Life, Jenny Unglow's Elizabeth Gaskell, A Habit of Stories, is the definitive modern biography. For historical context, Friedrich Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England was written about Manchester in the 1840s and provides the historical background for understanding Gaskell's novels. For literary analysis, Hilary M. Score's Scheherazade in the Marketplace explores how Victorian women writers like Gaskell used storytelling to intervene in public debates. For the North-South divide, Dave Russell's Looking North, Northern England and the National Immigration traces the cultural history of Northern identity that Gaskell helped shape. For modern perspective, Josephine McDonough's Child Murder and British Culture includes excellent discussion of how Gaskell and other women writers address social problems through domestic fiction. Thank you for joining me on this journey into industrial Manchester and Elizabeth Gaskell's powerful social fiction. I hope I've convinced you that she deserves to be remembered not just as a minor Victorian novelist, but as a crucial voice for social reform and cross-cultural understanding. Next week, we're moving from the industrial cities to the enchanting world of children's literature as we meet Beatrix Potter, another woman who challenged Victorian conventions in unexpected ways. We'll discover how this proper lady became a pioneering conservationist, a successful entrepreneur, and the creator of some of the most beloved children's stories ever written. Until then, keep reading and stay curious, and if you'd like to experience the Manchester that shaped Gaskell's vision, or the countryside where North and South drama unfolds, you can find out more at thebookclubtour.com. Well, my tea's getting cold, so until next time, keep reading and stay curious.